Vivi l'arte con nuove emozioni. Umbria, cuore verde d'Italia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming to this session. My name is Ros Atkins. I'm the BBC News analysis editor. And to my delight, we're going to be spending the next 20, 25 minutes learning about one of the biggest and one of the oldest news organizations in the world, Reuters, with the help of its editor-in-chief, Alessandra Galloni. I would hope that in the next 20 minutes, we're going to explore the nature of this celebrated and long-standing organizations so that we can understand how one of the best-known legacy news organizations in the world is evolving. We're also interested to explore how it's adapting and how Alessandra plans to lead it into a future which is, of course, fluid, uncertain, and exciting as well. And at the end, we'll definitely have 5 minutes for you to ask whatever questions you would like of Alessandra too. So first of all, welcome. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. Lovely to see you too.
Now, everyone knows Reuters. The brand is very well known, but perhaps they don't know the nature of the organization quite as well. So give us an idea, give us a primer. How big are you?
Reuters
What
101.
work do you do?
Yeah, so I mean, at the core, Reuters is the essential provider of trusted, unbiased news gathered at the source, which means around the world by our journalists who are on the ground around the world in 200 locations. So that's what we are. Then we have, as a business, Reuters has 3 different businesses, essentially. We provide news through our media clients, so we give our news to all the biggest TV networks, newspapers, digital sites around the world. It is in this way that we estimate, it's always hard to tell, but we estimate we reach up to about 2 billion people a day, so that's quite a bit. We have the sort of financial part of the business in which we provide news to a financial terminal that currently belongs to London Stock Exchange Group, so they own the terminal. We provide the content. This is a contract that we signed with them 3 years ago. It's a 30-year contract to provide financial news, and we provide it so through this terminal straight to people in the market, financial operators, anyone in the economy. And then the third part of our business is our professional business, which essentially is where we are venturing into sort of the B2C part, so direct interaction with consumers. And that is through our website, newsletters, podcast, and events. So those are sort of the 3 ways in which our news, sort of information, news, insight, analysis, investigations, get out to the public.
And of those 3, is one preoccupying you more? Are you placing more emphasis on some of those than on others?
I mean, really all 3, I have to say. Because, you know, all 3, I mean, first of all, when you're running sort of a diversified business, as it were, the point is that you have to pay attention to all of the 3 strands. The newest one, of course, is the professional one, in which that's the direct B2C and our website. So in terms of maybe in terms of, time spent thinking about the future and how it's going to change, it's more in that sphere because it's we're newer to the consumer sphere, unlike, the BBC, and that brings all sorts of challenges.
Well, yeah, how does this work? So we were talking just before we came out here about when I started at the BBC World Service about 20 years ago, and we were taught about the BBC World Service's two-source rule, which is essentially don't state anything as having happened unless you've got two reliable sources behind it, and Reuters was right near the top of the list of sources that we would routinely use. So as in that case, you were supporting my work and the work of all my colleagues, but as you're describing it, you're going to become a competitor to my work as well.
That's right. We hope to be a good competitor.
How does that work, though, if your business partly rests on selling journalism to organizations you're also competing with?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and of course it is sort of the existential question now that we're facing. You know, I think when we are providing news to the BBC and to other news organizations around the world, the most important thing is to provide trusted information from the ground speedily, right? Because you need to then be quick in preparing that, putting it into a product that you have on your evening news or, you know, however it is that you're going to use that. Likewise, when you're serving a financial audience, they need to know what's happening fast, and it needs to be trusted, because if you give a financial audience a wrong piece of news and they lose a lot of money, let me tell you, they're not going to come back to you. In the consumer sphere, it's a little, speed is always important because audiences want to know what's happening right away, but there's more attention to format and storytelling and what it is that you want to do with this. And I believe that, you know, there's not necessarily a conflict between being a provider of news to the BBC and being your competitor, because that same piece of news from the source, you might use it in one way for your audience, but we might format it or package it for our audience.
Well, let's talk about the source material. I'm interested in this. If I think back to the hundreds and hundreds of evenings I've spent on the TV with the director in my ear telling me what's happening next, and they'll often say, okay, we've got good pictures on Reuters. And they'll cut to some pictures that Reuters is filing into the BBC newsroom, and I'll talk over those pictures. Now, that's a classic piece of information that you might provide a client of yours like the BBC, but are the types of information and the types of journalism that clients of news agencies want changing? Do you have to provide a different portfolio of products, of information?
It depends, I think, on what part of the spectrum you are on news. So in a moment when something big happens on the ground, what every audience wants is to know what's happened, right? And that is pretty much the same for everybody. So, you know, earthquake in Turkey and Syria, a war, you know, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or national elections, or, you know, the death of the Queen. You know, that, in a way, spot news is easier because people just want to know what's happening, right? In the realm of what comes next, what comes after the news, then yes, audiences are changing. I mean, one of the things that we have seen is that people want more, audiences want more human stories. So not sort of a bird's eye view, but really for you to go down deep and understand sort of how is this affecting human beings? You know, what is the human story about it? Well, how is, you know, the destruction of the Amazon affecting the people there? What does it mean in the big picture? And explainers, which is something you've done so successfully at the BBC, becomes a big part of that. Another aspect that is very important we can talk about is points of view. And, you know, we have journalists working in their own countries in many places. We rely, so not only, for example, on foreign correspondents flying into places, but on journalists on the ground. And that gives out that diversity of views, which I think audiences increasingly want.
But help me unpack this a bit. So when you're talking about audiences, you're talking about the person who ends up consuming what you've produced. But I want to understand, let's take the example of deforestation in the Amazon, and you're doing a story about how that's impacted a community. Are you creating that story in order to give it to the BBC or one of your many other clients who will then take that information and use it in some way? Or when you're saying the audiences want that, are you increasingly talking about creating the story about that community and giving it direct?
Both.
Both.
I mean, both. And that's how, for us, the news ecosystem is changing. So that we will give you the trusted ingredients from the ground. So the visuals, the people speaking about how, you know, video of the person speaking about how it's affected their industry, their life, their homes, their families, for example. And you can do what you want with that information. But we can also then create package, create storytelling of our own. And I feel the world is large. I don't think, there's so many stories to be told in the world that I think there's room for both.
And as you guide Reuters away from being pure B2B to being B2B and B2C, how does that change what kind of a newsroom you're running, the kind of people you can attract into your organization? It feels quite fundamental.
It is. There are many ways to answer this, but you talked about people, and I think talent is an important part of this. Rightly, journalists like their work to be recognized. They like to have a platform so that their friends, their family can follow them, can see what they're doing. And for a B2B business, so for a provider of news to other news organizations, that's harder because we're at the source, but many times we're also behind the scenes. It's a great public service, I believe, what we do every day, but sometimes it doesn't have great sex appeal, right? Because your name is not sort of unnecessarily on a recognized platform. Now, it reaches a lot of people because, again, we reach 2 billion people a day. So as a journalist, your information is getting there.
Those people don't know the journalist who's
They don't necessarily know it, right? So having a platform, going straight to the consumer and having a platform through .com, through your app, is also a way for us to retain talent. It's a way for us to say, your incredible work, that all of it, that our 2,600 journalists around the world do, we are also giving you a platform to reach your audience directly. And that makes a difference in talent. It's one of the differences.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because I'm sure there are lots of people here in lots of different ways who try to attract the best new generation of journalists coming through. Do you think it makes it harder for you to attract a brilliant 23-year-old journalist starting out if your organization doesn't offer them public recognition for their work?
I mean, so far, I think we're okay on that front. We attract incredible journalists, early career, later career. So, we are not sort of struggling for talent. And part of the reason is that one thing we offer that most others don't offer is the ability to travel the world and the ability to report on, in 200 places around the world, and also in different types of journalism, because again, we are on the ground in Ukraine, just like we are on the ground or in the basement usually at central banks around the world. So if you are interested in finance and economics, you can come with us and have a stellar career. If you're interested in being a war correspondent, you can do that. You can do that too. If you're interested in the new, it's not new anymore, but understanding user-generated content and how to fact-check it and how to be sure that trusted information is going out into the world, you can come to us. So we don't have a problem attracting talent. It's more a question that we want to give our talent more visibility, right? It's also a way to progress. Also, with journalists, visibility can bring you the next source, right? The source will come to you if you keep doing great work that everybody sees.
Okay, we're getting a bit of attention there. So for any leader in the news industry at the moment, talent's a big issue. We've talked about that. We've got to talk about AI as well, because it's coming up an awful lot. And I think Reuters, more than some news organizations, already has worked with automation in some form over a number of years. So what lessons have you learned from that experience that's informing how you tackle AI as it evolves in the coming years?
Yeah. Well, as you say, we've been using automation, since the early 90s, mainly in our financial news, so mainly in the automation of, for example, economic indicators that are important for the market, important for policymakers. We've been using translation techniques. We publish in 15 languages, and many of those stories that we publish in 15 languages, we also want to publish in English, so we have, already translation techniques. But there's always a human. There's always a human there checking and making sure. And so sometimes, for example, that translation will only be a part of the story, and then the Reuters human will then make it into something else. So this we've been using for a long time. What's different now with the new generative AI is that, as we know, it can create a very human-like story from scratch instantly that looks good, feels good, and crucially is distributed really fast. So the way we're thinking about it, but we don't have an answer yet. Like all news organizations, we're figuring it out. But the key things we're looking at is how much to use it, how to use it, and how much human intervention. Like how much does the human is involved? One, transparency. how much do you tell your audience that this particular article, for example, has been partly generated by AI? If we believe, as I know the BBC believes, that we need to be transparent with our audience, then why shouldn't we be transparent that part of this article, or indeed the whole article, has been created? Second thing. Sorry, you were about to jump in.
Well, I was going to say, so you could end up in a situation where you have two bylines, one the name of the AI which has generated the article, the other the Reuters journalist?
I don't know, Reuters, Ros Atkins plus ChatGPT. I don't know. These are all questions, they're real questions. And the third thing, which I think is really important, is accountability. It is still a Reuters article. And so one needs to be accountable, right? Like all news organizations need to be accountable for what they publish. Again, we don't have answers yet, but these are the things that we're looking at.
And I'm sure all of your equivalents across the news industry wouldn't claim to have the answers either, but what are you doing to try and find the answers? Are you putting things in place to try and put Reuters in a better position to handle this?
It's a mixture of understanding what we have done thus far with the automation that we have used and how, I mean, look, everybody makes mistakes, including robots. And so what are the measures we have already put in place when automation goes wrong, really studying that. Going back to what we have these Reuters trust principles, which are at the core of everything we do, which sort of remind us every day that we have to supply trusted, unbiased, verified news, kind of really using that as our North Star. And then, we haven't, again, we're really, still figuring this out, but, there's going to have to be a little bit of experimentation.
Is trust, I mean, I was sitting here with Vivian Schiller from the Aspen Institute and others talking about transparency and trust yesterday. Is trust such an issue for Reuters, given that your long-standing business is selling journalism to organizations like the BBC who trust you? You don't have to earn our trust particularly because we've been working with you for years.
Yeah, I mean, trust is foundational. If we screw up, you won't trust us anymore. And as I was saying before, if you screw up with a financial operator and you lose them a lot of money, they won't trust you anymore. I don't think trust can be taken for granted. You have to work hard for trust every day. And that is true for other news organizations who are our clients, and it is true for the consumer directly.
One last question for you before we open it up to all of you. You've been in the job for a relatively short period of time. You're in the process of shaping what Reuters is going to become. As you work on the consumer offering, what have you got in mind? What do you think Reuters can offer the consumer that perhaps the consumer's not getting elsewhere?
Yeah. What I think is our unique nature is that I call it our glocality, terrible name, but basically we're both global and we're local. So that where we operate, we have this unique mix of global reach and global view, if you will, but we also have really deep expertise on the ground. And when you mix those together, that's a really powerful, that creates a powerful solution, which I think in the world of today with audiences who are more sophisticated, I mean, let's face it, audiences, are seeing what's happening on the ground in Ukraine by looking on TikTok, right? They're seeing it already. So what do sort of traditional, news organizations provide? They have to provide something more. And I think that a value added, if you will, and I think that glocality, for lack of a better word, that we have really provides that mix of local expertise and global view that I do think consumers will be interested in.
Thank you very much. I've got lots more questions, but I'm aware we've got 5 minutes left. And if any of you in the audience have a question, I'd be delighted to hear it. There's a woman just here, please.
Hi, thank you so much. What you were just talking about is really interesting and just connects with the last panel I was in, where we were talking about the death of the foreign correspondent. How are you thinking about that parachuting Western journalists in versus using local journalists on the ground? How are you thinking about that?
Did somebody really say the death of the foreign correspondent?
Yeah.
Wow, okay, well, I'm happy to report that we have many foreign correspondents who are alive and well. Well, look, I think the truth is that as news organizations have had to, for resource reasons, cut down on permanent representation in many countries around the world. And as audiences, to what I was saying before, are really demanding something more, local correspondents, so people reporting in their own countries, is becoming a much bigger way to cover global news. Again, we've done it, all the time. And it is a great opportunity, and I think that every news organization, can learn from the reporters who are on the ground reporting on their own countries. But it is often very dangerous for local reporters to report in their own countries. Just the fact of operating in your country for a foreign news organization, because it is foreign for them, could cause you to be called a traitor. I mean, our dear journalist, Danish Siddiqui, who died in Afghanistan nearly 2 years ago, when one of the greatest work that he did was in India when he was covering the COVID pandemic in his own country. And he had phenomenal, really, really important photographs showing the true toll of the COVID pandemic in India. For doing this, he was trolled on internet. He was called a traitor because he was telling the truth about his country to the world. So I think there is a great responsibility, great and growing responsibility of news organizations that want to cover the world to support local journalists who are a crucial part of foreign reporting. What does it even mean to be foreign reporting, right? I mean, it is global, international reporting from every corner of the world. So it's a great opportunity for news organizations that don't have that, but it's also a challenge.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you very much indeed for the question. There's another question here at the front.
Hi, thank you. My name is Yu Bing, and I have a question about the digital convergence. There's some reports that more and more young people right now, they are not trusting traditional news organization, maybe including the news agency like Reuters and maybe like BBC, the traditional broadcasting corporation. And like more and more TikTok, this kind of like vertical video softwares are getting more of attention of the young people. How do Reuters in the future to tackling with this challenge and also to transfer itself to win the next generation of the users? Thanks.
It's a big one to finish on.
Goodness gracious. Well, you've just sort of highlighted one of the existential issues, that all news organizations have. This is not only the topic of one session, but a whole festival could be on this. But first of all, I do really believe that people rely on, look for, and want trusted news, want verified facts, because facts are at the foundation of everything else. It is great to have opinion, it is great to lobby, it's great to believe in something, it is great to be a crusader, that is great for many, many people. But the role of news organizations like ours is to give you the facts. And I think that I bring it back to that because everything you describe, if you don't have people verifying the facts on the ground, you cannot have anything else. And I think that is true for a new generation. I wonder whether this is where we mentioned that AI. Ros sent me this incredible article, about an article about something that many of you know about, which is the creation of this new piece of music that had made the rounds, and it was created all by AI. And we were talking before about the fact that do people still want to know how a piece of content, how a piece of art, how a piece of culture was made? For the last 20 years, celebrities have become even bigger celebrities because everybody's wanted to know what they do, how they look like when they wake up, or what they do in their free time, right? Reality television has become all the rage, and people like pieces of art or content because they know what's behind it. I still think that's very powerful. I don't think AI or any other new technology is going to change that. We've trained our audiences to want to know what is behind the creation of a piece of content, of a piece of information, of a piece of art. And so I think, I'm sorry if I go back to the basics in answering your question, but I think that covering something, finding the fact, finding the truth, and being transparent about how you found that truth is still really the foundation of everything.
And that reminds me, just as And it reminds me of how sometimes at the BBC we'll talk about how nothing's changed and everything's changed, because nothing's changed in our fundamental mission to report the world fairly and accurately, and to do that with the due diligence that you would expect is no different to when we started the BBC. But the way we're manifesting that ambition needs to fundamentally change. And so that's sometimes a useful way of thinking about it. The core mission stays the same, but the way we manifest it doesn't. We're out of time. Alessandra, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you.